I guess I'll just have them each individually sit then and think about it and chat. I need those buffers set. I need 10-minute buffers. Okay.
Welcome to Columbia International University's Masters in Clinical Counseling program. CIU was founded in 1923. At CIU, we are devoted to international missions while continuing to impact the world for Christ through our advanced professional programs. The mission of CIU's Clinical Counseling program is to offer professional training in clinical mental health counseling within a biblical worldview in order to provide Christ-like therapeutic relationships for healing and growth. The training model focuses on the heart, through personal and spiritual development, the head through professional knowledge and research, and the hands through effective interpersonal and clinical skills. A few distinctives set CIU's clinical program apart. CACREP accreditation demonstrates that we meet the highest standards for clinical counseling programs, providing a curriculum that prepares you both in content and practice for state licensure in South Carolina and most other states. As an intentionally Christian program, our faculty teach students to see people as made holistic and in the image of God. Drawing from the biblical declaration that all humans have value and worth as created by God in His image, our students learn to identify the values and beliefs that they hold, to deliberately integrate in theory and in practice an understanding of people as embodied. Seeing people through a holistic lens means we recognize how problems and solutions must incorporate the whole self as physical body, psychology, emotion, social relationships, and spiritual life. Further, we believe that healing and growth happens best within the context of Christ-like therapeutic relationships. CIU's clinical counseling program teaches from a trauma-informed lens across our content, incorporating the latest training and research on trauma into our coursework, as well as an intensive trauma course within our required clinical core. We believe that learning occurs best by combining content and practice with students experiencing significant growth when they can observe themselves in role play and real clinical settings. To support students' clinical skills, we created counseling lab rooms where students can role play with peers and watch sessions recorded earlier in their program. Past sessions are reviewed with faculty and peers for feedback and to observe each student's growth over time through our Vault software system. Students can also observe our faculty provide counseling in real time through our observation room or through our video monitoring system. We believe that God made us for relationship, and it's in relationship that we learn, grow, and thrive. We use our physical space on campus as a means for fostering meaningful relationships with students, as well as between students and faculty and staff. Small class sizes, both in person and online, provide the means for connection. With a comfortable lounge and study area, kitchen and dining space, and faculty and staff offices with open doors and available schedules in close proximity to these areas, student counseling degree is a big commitment, and CIU seeks to improve accessibility and flexibility by offering our degree both residentially and online. Students can switch back and forth in modality, pursuing the degree at their own pace. CIU's clinical counseling program started in 1995, and we have strong and trusted partnerships across clinical settings in the Columbia area. We work with students to find the right fit for their internship, and we will work collaboratively with our site supervisors to train our students well. Many students receive job offers at their sites as they finish their internships. CIU is a great place to learn and grow, allowing God to work in and through you as you seek to serve Him through counseling. Apply to earn your Master's in Clinical Mental Health Counseling at ciu.edu/apply.
Okay, welcome everybody. I am Dr. Jackie Perry, and I am really excited to spend this morning with you. Hello, are you coming?
Hey, welcome, Brian.
We have one person we get to see in the audience. Okay, I feel like I should angle this a different way then.
Yeah, move it as you need.
Yeah. So today we are going to be talking about enhancing supervisee development of person, processes, and practices in clinical supervision. Seth, I have lost the clicker. Oh my goodness. Oh, there we go. Okay. Sorry, folks. Before I do this, and also, yeah, I feel rude not giving you eye contact. I've been in the field of clinical mental health counseling since '91, primarily working with children, adolescents, and families. Really, probably in the last 20 years or so, emergent adults and adolescents. And in about 2015, 16, I decided to go back and get my PhD as I was transitioning out of more direct care, doing a lot of teaching. In 2011, I became a supervisor. And so since about 2011, I've been doing a lot more supervision of folks, especially those who are interested in working with children, adolescents, and emergent adults. I don't know how you became a supervisor, but I know for me, I think I was dragging my feet quite a bit. The idea of taking somebody under my license, the idea of, I don't know, kind of having that liability. So even though I had the license to be able to do that in 2011, I've really only been supervising since about 2015. I currently have retired from clinical practice in my work with emergent adults and adolescents, full-time work at CIU since last fall, and I carry 9 supervisees under my license in the state of North Carolina. That's a big part of my practice as well as teaching. On a more personal note, I'm also a wife and a mom of 3 adult children who are all married and a grandchild. So that's a little bit about me. I'm going to talk about sort of my passions in this area, but before I do that, I would love to take a minute and have you each chime in and share a little bit about you. And this is a little hard to do digitally, but I'm going to put these pauses in as we go along so that I can sort of see a little bit. So you're in the room. Yeah.
Sure. My name is Brian Meesemer. I'm the Executive Director at the Christian Counseling Center. It's a nonprofit counseling ministry of First Presbyterian just down the road here.
Okay.
I've been in clinical practice 10 years. Just became the director about a year ago. So a lot more supervision in the last year than I've ever done before. At CIU grad, so master's student.
Oh, good. Well, welcome. We have one person here with us live. I'd love to see who else, if you all would be willing to put some things in the chat. I'm going to give you a couple minutes.
Looks like we have 10 attendees, but 2 of them are us. So.
Yeah, so there's 10 of you out there, no pressure, but figure out. I'm going to tell you some of the chatter in my head. I'm a little sleep deprived, so my inhibitions are a little down. But I'm thinking of Ferris Bueller right now. Oh, we have some more. Yay. Okay, well, what we are doing is introducing ourselves really quickly, and I just met Brian, and we've got about 10 people online. So they're currently on the chat, which I don't know if they have access to that, but it might be, well.
We could add on. So Nancy at Three Rivers is on here. She's a grad of our program, actually master's level.
Okay.
And she runs Three Rivers Behavioral Health, their
Okay.
intensive outpatients. And Liliana Camacho's from Mexico.
Yes, I know Lily. I've met you, Lily, and I know you're getting translation from one of our wonderful students, Christy. So hello, Christy. Thank you for translating. Yeah, what's your name?
LaDorna Gasson.
And where are you from?
I'm from Brain Psychiatric Hospital,
Oh, okay.
and I'm a counselor there. Actually, my supervisor is on as well, at house.
Okay. Great.
Um,
Okay, a clinical supervisor from Christian Family Care in Arizona. I know we have students.
that's what Stacy and Evangeline say.
That's right.
Michelle Lunca.
Stacy Milliken, yes, one of our students. Michelle Lunca? Is that?
That's who's in there. That's the.
Oh, that's a student, okay, she's not in my internship section. Okay, I will just keep monitoring that. There's a couple of times where if you can figure out how to use that, it would be great because I wanna pause and have a little bit of engagement. I wanna say this, I am not standing up here as an expert in supervision. The idea of speaking on supervision is a little, I don't know, it's a little out of my wheelhouse. Most of the speaking that I do is around clinical work with adolescents and emergent adults, as well as lots and lots of parenting seminars. And so I want this to be a we, in terms of me sharing some of the things that I think have been helpful and I would love to hear that from you as well. And especially with those who are in the room, I will speak so that those of you online can hear what they say or repeat. Okay, a couple more. Nicole from Loredac, I think I've met you. Thank you for coming. Kim from Decatur, Georgia. Wonderful. Thank you for being a supervisor for one of our students.
Anna House, that's your supervisor?
Anna House, yeah. And I think I've also met Anna in a supervision meeting with one of our supervisees, with one of our students. Okay. I think that we probably all intuitively know, but this is the definition that I want to use, a classic Bernard and Goodyear definition. What is supervision? It's a good place to start since that's what we're talking about. It's a process through which an experienced practitioner works with a supervisee to oversee professional development, to discuss issues arising from the therapeutic alliance, to teach or refine counseling skills, and to monitor and support ethical practice, all within the context of a partnership in which the supervisee feels free to discuss professional difficulties. And I don't know if you're struck by the depth of that. I know that it's intuitively what we're doing, but I also think it's a reminder when I look at this of, oh, no wonder that hour goes by really fast. Oh, no wonder I always feel like there's something else that we can be focused on, because I think that's a lot. And when we only have an hour, maybe 90 minutes in triadic supervision, it's a lot. We often get very cases that seem to take up so much of our time. A little bit about me, just so you know where I'm coming from. I think my clinical supervisor in Hickory, North Carolina, where I lived for a long time, developed the training for North Carolina's supervision license way back when we added the S to our licenses. And so I'm heavily influenced by where she came from, which is Bernard's discrimination model. I use a blend of that. I am as a practitioner. I tend to use IFS, CBT, and a narrative approach. And that influence has definitely led me to have a lot of neuro-informed relational supervision. So if I marry these two, and this is important just because I think you'll hear me talk, you'll catch my lens in the way that I'm presenting today. The Bernard, the discrimination model there is basically these 9 quadrants, or 12 sometimes, that third line is included, it's not always, but it's 3 different foci for supervision: intervention, conceptualization, personalization, and this professional behavior. And then the supervisee is moving from these different roles, from a teacher to a counselor to a consultant. And we could be moving in any of those quadrants at different times, at different moments on the same case. And I'm aware of that. I'm aware of sort of the way I'm moving, especially across the top of that grid in my time. This requires a lot of, I think, sort of tracking on my part for where is the supervisee developmentally with regard to these things. And then this model is a fairly new model. It's one of the more relational reflective models popular in other countries. But this particular model became on my horizon or on my radar a couple of years ago when I had a supervisee who was working and getting some training with Circle of Security. And this particular model interests me because it takes attachment and the idea of being a secure base and a safe haven, and it slides it into the supervisor role. And when I started reading about the supervisor circle of safety, I started thinking, this is a lot of who I am in my clinical work. This feels very natural for me to sort of think about this in terms of how I support my supervisees. In this model, the supervisee-supervisor relationship is bi-directional. There's this back and forth happening, and I think that's true of any of these models. And it's the supervisor who's kind of bearing the responsibility in containment, in interpretation, in managing the relationship, and both parties are willing to engage in this relationship to succeed. Since relational competency is identified as an important focus of supervision, and I'm going to spend a lot of time approaching supervision through this attachment or relational framework to me makes sense. Because so much of what we want our clinicians to gain is this sense of attunement, the sense of pacing, the sense of containing, of slowing down, of sorting and selecting, of perspective taking, of being self-aware. It helps me sort of offer that in a way that they can reflect that back, hopefully, in the clinical practice. So in the end, hopefully these two foster safety, they foster trust, they foster a nourishing relationship. And I think that's the biggest thing that I see, especially in establishing a relationship with anybody, is the idea of helping people feel safe, seen, soothed, and secure, which are those key pieces of attachment. Okay. So, it's over there, but I will sort of monitor it in just a minute. When you think of the person of the counselor, as it relates to a counselor in training, so this idea of who they are as a person, and since you two are in the room, I would love some input on this, no pressure. I bet you wish you were at home now. But if you, or you can scan this, but if you're at home, if you could scan the QR code or put in the code at the top at menti.com, and this will make a word cloud, but I'd love for you to start throwing out words that come to mind, especially when you think of the person of the therapist in their early career. What are some descriptives? And you can feel free to use the chat. I would love for you to lean on the word. I'm not gonna all look at it. If I disconnect that, will it disconnect it?
It'll pull it from there, but you can disconnect it and we just reconnect it for them because it's only the two of them. Everyone else online can still see it.
I kind of want to see what's coming in. And I would love to hear words from you all as far as what words come to mind when you think of the person of the counselor. Let's see if any of these are coming in.
I'll throw one out, I think. Anxious is one of the first ones.
Yeah, for sure. Let's just go ahead and use the chat because I don't think it's connecting. So if you're watching live, if you could use the chat and just help me out, and it's okay. So anxious was one of the words. What else?
Fear.
What's that?
Fear
lots of
of
fear.
the unknown.
Yeah,
Like, you know, as a counselor, sometimes you wanna be able to be that counselor to get it right all the time, even though you're not gonna get it right all the time. So, you know, just trying to juggle the fear of the unknown. Am I really helping the client, or am I really hurting the client?
that's right.
Or the information I'm giving them, is it helping them
Yeah.
to, you know, cope? So, yeah.
Yeah, that's a huge thing, is the anxiety and fear that especially early career counselors have. I often say to, really honestly in the context of parenting, but I'm big into just understanding up and down brain and left and right. And our left brain uses the past to predict the future. And if we don't have a past to predict the future, there's a lot of anxiety as a result of that. And so for our counselors who haven't been, especially for those who are in internship, they don't really have this canvas that can kind of imagine. And so the fear, and I think teaching ethics this semester, perhaps I'm one of those people who instills it, is that non-maleficence and not wanting to do harm to the client is certainly one of those fears. And on top of that, I think about, you know, just the fear of our boards, our licensing boards, and those cases that you read, and am I gonna be one of those? Because certainly those people didn't start out with the desire to harm any clients that they were seeing. So on the board, we're seeing interest, open to learning and change. I definitely see this, a posture of openness and curiosity, nervousness, curious how to use the models in session. Yes, I'm going to talk about that. This running ahead of like, I need to teach you everything that I've learned, and forgetting sort of like you are the most important thing right now. Did I do the right thing? Worried and anxious. Thank you, Nancy. Imposter syndrome, that's a huge thing of just, I don't know what I'm gonna do, and so I'm gonna just put this mask on, which I would label as disembodiment. That's a fact. And yeah, hyper self-aware. Another person said imposter syndrome and success-driven. Yes, these are you know, this is a talk for another time, but all of these are things that affect presence. When we think about the brain, right brain is present, left brain is this thing that pulls us away, and this does affect their ability to be present. And also, let me just normalize it. This is, I remember back in the days, it was a long time ago. You might be wondering why first of all, why I crammed all these words onto this obnoxious slide. But as I was thinking about today, this was a couple of weeks ago, I actually started going down this like history hole in my head and just thinking about, I started graduate school to get my master's in 1989. And I've said to my students many times, the field has massively changed since 1989. In terms of therapeutic modalities, it's a totally different landscape. So I thought I would kind of very quickly go through where we were and kind of where we are, and this is far from being comprehensive. This is mostly from my head and then a little bit of help from ChatGPT, but most of it is just key theorists. So when we think about 100+ years ago, we have Freud, we have Adler, and we have Jung. And interestingly, actually, when we think of supervision, I don't know, fun fact, but the first supervision sessions were held in the early 1900s. Freud and his buddies, Freud realized that this work was going to require work on the part of the analyst, and that they would need to explore their own issues or conflicts. And so the earliest supervision sessions, at least that are documented, are in the early 1900s, where once a week, every Wednesday, he would gather with his buddies, they would eat cake, they would discuss cases, and they would smoke. So, which makes me laugh because it's far from what my supervision looks like these days, but we have this interesting history there. That's where Little Hans came into being, and so many of you probably are familiar with that case of Little Hans. Anyways, so we go from the 1900s, and then we have behaviorism and Watson, We start to see Rogers' theory and the 1900 theory, where we start to see this new concept of the importance of empathy, congruence, and unconditional positive regard. These are things that are really focusing now on the presence of the therapist. But then we have still this very behavioristic, this sort of almost, again, to use left and right brain, more left brain modalities of focusing on behavior and action. Then we start to see more of this connected to thought, still very left brain. So we have rational emotive behavior therapy. It definitely has this emotional piece, which is right brain, but it's very much still looking at these irrational cognitions. Cognitive therapy of Beck. Then we see the flourishing of systemic therapies, family systems therapy, structural family therapy. So we start to see a real emphasis on person in context, which starts to matter and shift sort of how we show up. That's when I come into the field is in the 80s, not that it matters to you, but this is where we were in the 80s. We started to see 80s, 90s, narrative therapy by White and Epstein. This is where DBT, Marshall Linehan's work, starts to come into being. So we talk more about emotion regulation. So you see that shifting happening. We start having acceptance and commitment therapy, which is huge because this idea of mindfulness as well as some of these cognitions. We're blending with behavioral change. And then we have, as we're hitting the 2000s, we have EMDR, which is again, I remember studying EMDR for the first time, and I remember the trainer said, we actually don't really fully understand how this works. We just know it does. And just this idea of trauma memory processing and integrating those. And then right there at the end of those 2 decades, we have Pat Ogden and sensory motor processing. And now here we are, and this list is ridiculous. Just the numbers of modalities, and I'm sorry if your modality is not on here, but we start to see things in the early 2000s that start to really pop up on the scene. Richard Schwartz's internal family systems. This is a clinician really helping guide the person into understanding parts. And a big part of IFS is finding it in your body. Where is it? How does it feel? How do you feel towards it? What does it look like? Then we have the work of Vander Kolk, we have the work of Peter Levine that are really starting to help us understand as clinicians, hey, trauma is actually stored in the body. And we're understanding a lot about how this patterns our nervous system. And then we have Porges and the polyvagal theory and the somatic therapies that are kind of branching off of that, and sensory motor processing, SSP, and then somatic experiencing, or SE, releasing stored trauma from the nervous system. Our students get excited about these therapies. They get so excited about the effectiveness. Some of them have never used them personally, which is interesting, and that's for another slide. But these therapies are pretty fantastic. And like most therapies, they're not for everybody, but we're seeing a much higher percentage of these modalities using and helping using the body and really being more somatic therapies. Again, we're not seeing these die, but these are being integrated now, and I'm the product of that as well. I didn't start using IFS until the last 8 years, really, the end of my practice. And the idea of moving into the body, I didn't have any clinical training. We didn't talk about the body. There was no neuroscience. So this is where we are. And I think we need to remember that this has affected the person of the therapist, and it's really important for us to think about this as supervisors. We see a movement from a more analytical stance. In fact, some of the writing of psychoanalysis would really talk about Freud saying that our posture is that of a delicate surgeon. This very neutral stance in the room. Of course, he still acknowledged the fact that our issues are in the room, but it was a very distant stance. And then we moved to person-centered, which is, hey, the biggest factor of change is your ability to be congruent, to have unconditional positive regard. Congruent meaning genuine, like the inside equals the outside, there's no mask there, and then full of empathy, right? And we all, every student, hopefully, it has this as a foundation now. We realize, and the literature shows this, that person-centered has to be at the foundation of our therapeutic alliance. And then we start to have this idea of behaviorist, psychoanalysis, psychodynamic approaches, acknowledgement of self as a touchstone of relational therapy that really, again, it's a little deeper than person-centered, this idea of you are in the room and use that. Again, transference was always used in the way back, but then we see, if you kind of lay this on top of that timeline I just gave, that the role of the therapist is one that's embodied. And one of the things in my teaching of prac students and internship students, especially, and even now in the state of North Carolina, we have to view tapes regularly for supervisees under license. So I often find myself saying, "Where'd you go? Where'd you go? You just left the room," and you can see it on a tape, and students really need to see this on tapes because they can see what Bonnie Badenoch in interpersonal neurobiology calls the implicit left of the pull, implicit pull of the left brain. It's this movement to what do I say, what do I need to do, all of that, instead of who do I need to be. And I always say, the question is more who do you need to be in the room rather than what do I need to say or what do I need to do. But there's this tension because we still believe that it's what I say, this great nuggets of wisdom, or what I have the client doing is going to change. But we have immense amounts of research. One of my favorite writers in this space, if you've not read Bonnie Badenoch's stuff, Brainwise Therapist, she also has a workbook for students. It's quite dense, but the workbook really brings it home and really helps students realize that wellness, our understanding is stemming from two brains and two bodies in the same room, impacting each other. And that when I'm sitting across from my client, it is actually their right brain reading my right brain. So we now are basically understanding what Carl Rogers was saying. Their right brain reading 7 pieces of information so fast before their left brain hears the word. And by the way, those are, and I like to emphasize these with my students, this is Dan Siegel's work, it's eye contact. It's facial expressions, it's tone of voice, it's gestures, it's posture, it's timing and intensity. And those are his hand motions. He has parents do quite a bit. Because if we're thinking about really wanting to understand this, and more importantly, if we have students who are picking theories that are more on this end, that are really relying on psychodynamic kinds of principles, this attachment relationship matters, this idea that the therapist is an attachment figure, then to focus so much on what you're saying, what you're doing, et cetera, and not who you are, we do a disservice to our students. And so, this is pulled, again, from the work of Dan Siegel and that whole group of folks, interpersonal neurobiology, really neuroscience. And it can get a little thick and deep, but this is one of the things that, they're talking about in the therapy relationship. In our students sitting across from another, the mutuality of the therapeutic relationship is at play. So their attachment history, so we're talking about this, we might not say it to our clients, but their attachment history, how they show up in the room, matters. So oftentimes I'll have students say, I think they have an avoidant presentation. I think they have an insecure, anxious presentation. Well, that's good, but what we know is there's 2 people in the room. So what I know about me is that people who have a certain presentation are going to activate my attachment style. So our attachment styles are in the room as well. This idea that the body is a part of every memory. Again, that's sort of more where we are now in understanding that everything is processed in mind, body, all over physiologically. Well, then, if my client is telling me, thinking personally about a client, about the car wreck that he was in, and the 3 people who died in the car wreck, and what he remembers seeing, and is naming some of those things, we need to not play pretend and know that those things are activating my body. Any memories I might have with trauma, any personal experiences, and so there's this dyadic impact, right? Our brain can and do change. Neuroplasticity is real, which we now know this, and it's a beautiful thing. However, let's not be mistaken that our clients have the capacity to change us for better or for worse, particularly when I don't have buffers in place. And when I'm not conscious of this, it's a part of burnout and counselor impairment, is the lack of recognition that the stories, the postures, the intensity, the pace of my practice is also changing my body. Neural integration and coherence are foundational for healing and well-being. So this is that principle of just when we see connectivity this way and connectivity this way, this is fostering flourishing. Again, so this is why 10 years ago you didn't see it much. Definitely 15 years ago, you didn't have therapists saying, where do you feel that in your body? And oftentimes people will ask, why does that matter? It's because when I'm asking that question and you're answering it, you're actually using your upper brain to answer that question. And so by using your upper brain to notice what's a lower brain function in your body, fostering integration. We know this. This is part of healing. It's the same thing for our students. That integration and coherence with them offers that. One of the things that Dan Siegel says a lot in his work, particularly with parents, but also with clinicians, is to the extent that you have coherence in your story is to the extent you can foster that. Said another way, you can only take people as far as you yourself have been. So these are great ideas. Students grab a hold of them and it's like, I can't play pretend in this regard. I either have integration and coherence in the session or I don't. It's not something that I like hold, but that it's a real dynamic process. Right brain and left brain processes promote healing. I already said this right brain back and forth. There's a podcast by somebody named Adam Young, and he does a really good job of making somebody's work. His name is Ian McGilchrist, and he talks about the right brain and the left brain. It's called The Master and His Emissary. It's kind of, I tried to read it and I was thankful for this podcast that helped me understand it. But he really is talking about just how fast this right brain is, and that yes, we need language and interventions and techniques, but really that's why clients come back, is what they're experiencing. And again, we know this. And then mindful attention is a key agent of change. How the counselor is being attuned to the client, how the client is being attuned to themselves, all of that matters. So, what did I just do? Oh, there we go. Okay. This is from a couple of writers who are writing on something called intersubjectivity, and just the importance of two people in the room. But embodied perspectives propose that interactions between embodied subjects, me being in my body and being aware, lie at the cornerstone of therapeutic change. It's one of the reasons, people like Peter Levine, Van der Kolk, all of these have influenced the field in really talking about one of the first things you need to do is notice the posture and notice the physical presentation of your client. Because you can have therapy, and if he has great videos where he's talking about, they're not open. And so counselors have been doing a much better job of being able to notice that, foster some connectivity, and it's impacting, it's impacted by the ability of the counselor to do that. So concepts such as attunement, co-regulation, resonance, synchrony, all of these rely on somatic awareness, and they're regularly acknowledged as foundational to the interpersonal processes between the counselor and the client, as well as outcomes. So, brings me to the first part of today. How do we, going back to that original definition of supervision, these are the four pieces. Again, this is Bernard and Goodyear's, but these are the different, how do we oversee development of the person, of the therapist? How do we focus on the alliance and help them focus on alliance? How do we teach or refine skills? And then how do we monitor and support ethical practice when we're specifically talking about the person of the therapist? This is extremely important when we look at what's happening. post-COVID, and these are statistics I didn't cite because they're a combination, they're incorporating the research of just psychologists, just social workers, just counselors, and these are definitely all post-COVID. And I'm standing up here as a victim of COVID. I retired in 2023. COVID played a role in the last 3 years of my 33-year career. It impacted me, so this is part of it, but these statistics are not that old. They're 2023, 2024. But we're seeing burnout affecting 21 to 50% of people in the mental health field. And when you divide it, and this is a huge one for our work with students, is work-life balance challenges. 60%. The paperwork, the minutia that we don't really talk, I don't think we talk about enough in clinical mental health counseling. What else you're gonna be just doing besides the magic of sitting across from a client. The compassion fatigue, just that notion of being impacted by the stories that we sit across from and how real that is, let alone, kind of connected to this vicarious trauma or secondary stress. And then stressors. I have a life, my supervisees have a life, and I ask them often about their lives because I know these play into what's happening. And then other things like insurance, low pay, the severity and complexity of clients increasing. If I could have a dollar for every time a student, or particularly a supervisee, has told me, if I had known this in my graduate program, like, one of the things is I didn't know I was going to be paying a supervisor for 3 years, $100 every time I met with her for this long. I didn't know that. That wasn't factored in, and not everybody has to do that. But all of these things that we don't really talk about is huge. So we really need to be thinking about the person of the therapist. Now, I don't know if you follow Dr. Becky Itkett inside. But if you work with children and families, you should. She just has good language, and I'm all about stealing good language to help us understand complex topics. So not that long ago, like within the last 2 weeks, she was at Duke and somewhere else in the state of North Carolina, and she was talking to college students about this notion of the learning space. And it was such a great video to watch as you see these 20-some-year-olds looking at her talking about this. But she said, when we face anything new, we're in the learning space. We don't have, the left brain can't predict the future because the left brain doesn't have a past. If you're taking a class and it's the first time and you're in Physics 52, I'll never forget that class. And it's like, I've never done Physics 52, I don't know this. And in the case of our supervisees, I've never sat across from somebody who's 3 times my age, who cusses like a sailor, who's been at war, and he's in a wheelchair and he's angry all the time. I've never done this. So what we tend to see is when we're on the other side of that, we haven't gone through what she calls the learning space. Well, first of all, she says the learning space, the dominant emotions that you're gonna feel in the learning space are frustration, anxiety, and fear. And I'm going to step on my soapbox for just a minute. We live in a culture that somehow has pathologized the idea of having a little frustration, anxiety, and fear, and so we've moved to avoidance or turning down the volume instead of really helping embrace. This is what we're all going to feel. Me too. The first time I sat across from somebody as a supervisor, and I was actually getting paid, I remember thinking, I don't really know what I'm going to do. I don't know how to do this. I didn't even have great supervision, but the dominant emotions are going to be this. And when you don't know how to do something, and this is a great thing to share with students or supervisees, because what they're going to do is they're going to share it with their clients, is we go in 2 directions. This is the brain at work. We're going to go to rigid, over control, or we're going to go to chaos and overwhelm. And that's the work of Dan Siegel. He talks about it on a little stream. It's a cute little picture of a person in a sailboat, and I like taking that metaphor and really talking about it, that we go onto the banks. And so asking the question, with these tough clients, where do you find yourself going? Rigid and over control are those cases that come into your supervisee sessions where they're like, tell me what I should do. I just need to know. I just get like, what, I need tools, I need techniques. It's that over control. I've got to put something into place because I've never worked with a vet who's had all that's a case that I'm working with right now. Or chaos and overwhelm. I just can't. Can we talk about how do I refer this person? Because I just can't. It's overwhelming me. So we're gonna see this. I kayak. I'm not a rapid river kayaker, but I've certainly had my bumps on the bank where I've gotten stuck. And it is this moving awkwardly from bank to bank, kind of dodging the rocks in a river. What do we need to get from there to here, all of us? Because we all have learning spaces in our lives, is we need some of these things here. We need a little distress tolerance, befriending and noticing some of these emotions. And again, that's the soapbox. We don't have a lot of that these days, but just like emotions come and emotions go and you'll be okay. We need emotion regulation skills because there is a benefit for our supervisees and clients to learn how to quiet the nervous system, to know what it reacts to, what are the patterns of mind. We need some character and some virtue in here, which is just like these habits that are going to form the way we think about new things, that are going to form the way we engage with people. We need connection. This is part of our relationship with supervisees. We need some support. We need to be able to imagine. I feel blessed that I've had clients over the years, as well as supervisees, say that they could hear me or picture me saying, you got this, or behind their client going, you're doing great. That support can be imagined. We do need our supervisees to have a growth mindset. I've said to especially students who come in all different flavors, right? There's a place for everyone in this field, for sure. And there are definitely places for the client, for the supervisees who really need a lot of control and sameness and uniformity. There's a place for them. There are actually places that serve people. It's like, this is the way we do it, and this is the way we're always gonna do it. But for most of our work, working across from people, we need this growth mindset. I'm just amazed when I look back at 91 and where these terms are that I didn't know. And so being able to sort of embrace learning, we need to be vulnerable. I often say to my supervisees, you're not gonna harm, sort of what you were saying before, we're not gonna harm. So it's okay to be a little vulnerable and try something that feels a little uncomfortable. Presence, being in your body, and then just being able to name. This is in talk for another time, but Lisa Feldman Barrett, Mark Brackett, who's at Yale, Lisa Feldman Barrett's out in California doing a lot of really cool work on emotional labeling, affective labeling, and the power in just being able to name your emotions. Name it to tame it, feel it to heal it, those kinds of things. So all of that is why we need to attend to the person of our supervisee. So I'm breaking this up into 3 different sections. Some of this is going to be hopefully obvious, but I want us to just think about this in terms of the supervisees that you see. So if you've been in supervision for a while, you know that there's this parallel process happening, right? That what is happening between me and my supervisee is somehow reflective of what's happening between them and their clients. And so noting my relationship with them. I have a fresh, new supervisee who's brand new licensed, just started working with her. And I'm doing digital technology, so telehealth. And I'm just noticing how much she's very nervous about our time together and wanting to please me and wanting to say the right thing and not always knowing how to engage. It feels very one way. And it's really helpful for me to think about it. This happens to be the supervisee who's seeing a vet 3 times her age, who's in a wheelchair, who kind of reminds her of her grumpy, grandfather in some ways, but just noticing that, because that for me, I call data. It's really, really helpful. One of the things I want to foster in my supervisees is this notion of self-awareness. what's happening live. And if you do tapes, this is the perfect way to catch self-awareness. Interpersonal process recall, or IPR, is something I'm doing often. I'll just say stop the tape. And rather than the supervisee focus on what's happening with the client, which is helpful, well, what's happening in you? I like this acronym that I've stolen from kind of Dan Siegel, but really more Kurt Thompson, who was trained under him for a while, is SIFT-B. And it's touching on all of the things that are at play in any moment. What are you sensing? So that's physiological. What's happening in your heart rate? What do you remember doing with your, what was going on with your muscles, your breathing rate? So sensing is this physiological piece. What were you imaging right there? And we've had laughter talking about the real things that are imaging, from I just was looking at the clock trying to have the time end, to imaging something very related to what they're saying. What are your emotions? So a catchy phrase that I like to use when we're talking about feeling is all they are is energy and motion. Feelings are energy synaptically moving through your body that we're giving a name to, and it's moving. So it's very related to sensing. But what are you naming it? What are you naming that? What are you thinking about? Actually, more accurately, what are you believing to be true? And in those moments, it's like anything from, I can't do this. I don't know what he just said. I don't know what's happening. I think of a supervisee, and she really wanted me to see a tape because she wasn't sure if the client, complex trauma history, and the client was dissociating or actually having a seizure or those kinds of things. So what were you thinking? And then what did you want to do in that moment? The B is inclined to do. What did you want to do in that moment? This fosters self-awareness. SIFT-B is a great thing. I've been in a community of therapists, and this is the way we respond to everything. And then, because I think it's really important to remember the multicultural piece of all of our clients, and all of our supervisees are sitting across from somebody who in no way, shape, or form is like them. So it's also helping them understand, or not understand, but tune into, and I think about this particular case with the client who was potentially dissociating. What biases did you have right there? What assumptions did you have? This is a small North Carolina town. It's a community mental health agency. This is a very poor woman who has a really complex, painful history. What assumptions, biases, or prejudices would you maybe be holding about this client? In that moment, let's name them. Let's not pretend that you're not carrying these. And when I've taught multicultural, definitely when I'm teaching ethics now, one of the things I like to do is ask students to stop what's happening. Because the truest thing being told in any moment is happening underneath your consciousness sometimes, and your nervous system is very, very in it, very a part of it. And so it's the way that we can know what kinds of biases or convictions, assumptions are being held. So it's a great thing to help enhance awareness. Yeah.
Got a question on recommendations of the platforms that you love to use for supervisees to record virtual or in-person sessions.
Yeah, so I fear answering that question on something that is recorded. So because I don't get them so I don't receive those videos in the mail. They're sharing from their device. So I have some that work for organizations that have WebEx, and they're just sharing their WebEx, and we're only looking at max a 10-minute segment. We may do more. Many of mine are playing recordings, and I will say in our setup, which I'll talk about in a little bit, I will say, it is your job to make sure that you're using HIPAA-approved devices, all of that. But when you're sharing these with me, I'm not going to ask you, that's on you. So sometimes they're putting up a device to the speaker and we're hearing it that way. I, as a policy, don't receive recordings anymore, and in the university, we have a software that we use that's secure. That's a great question. I use Zoom as my platform, and they share screens, so it keeps me from having to own any problems, and I know there are some problems with that, so that's why I'm a little sheepish in answering that. Sometimes when I see an iPhone coming up and they're playing it, I'm like, you delete that thing. It's not labeled, it's pretty obscure, but it's still extremely HIPAA non-compliant. So thank you for that question, and there's my admission, I'm a real person like you. Okay, last thing. And I think I have a slide that has this on the next, is this idea of window of tolerance. And many supervisees are very aware of this because they're teaching neuro-informed, trans-theoretical principles in their work with their clients, whether they're doing CBT or REBT, whatever. They're understanding this idea. But what they're not always doing is understanding where they are. And when we're talking about burnout, counselor impairment and all the things, it's really important for us to be asking them to ask themselves, where are you on the window of tolerance? And how big is your window? Sometimes I'm asked by students or supervisees, what's the ideal schedule? What does it look like? What's a good balanced schedule? And I would say one of the biggest factors is your window of tolerance and your own personal margins, the season of life, because I've certainly had seasons where my window is really small. Maybe I had health issues, maybe I was raising little children, all of that. So we really need to help our supervisees know, like, have you had the conversation with your supervisees? How big is your window of tolerance, especially when you're doing new things? What do you notice about your capacity to sort of stay in this yellow or green zone and not moving into hyperarousal? It's silly to not assume that most of our supervisees are living on that high yellow red in the beginning stages. And so if we're having conversations about it, it's like, okay, what are you gonna do about that? Your nervous system is really kind of dealing with a lot. And then what we know about, well, I'm going to talk about it in a minute, but too much hyperarousal is going to cause a crash to the system, and we'll have a little bit of go into hypoarousal. I don't have really great statistics on this, but generally speaking, 1/3 of the people who are in the field are trauma survivors. It's what drew them to this field, and it actually makes them, in some ways, a good candidate as long as they've done their work. But make no mistake, I've done my work for years, and I still can get activated by a story. I still can have this sense of overwhelm. I live in North Carolina. Hurricane Helene hit us hard. I was in the midst of working with trauma workers, and I didn't do well by about 30 days in. I was beyond. So all of us have these frail, fragile bodies we live in. But when we're talking about our supervisees, who about 1/3 have trauma histories, and some of them have not done their work, or not doing work, we need to realize that window is not going to be very big. The reality is when students or supervisees are first entering the field, they're going to get high caseloads, or that ramp up is going to happen fast in some places. And it's dependent, their pay is often dependent on this. And so high caseloads with little buffer, meaning boom, 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 30-minute break, but sometimes there's a meeting during that break or an hour break, and then boom, 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 I go home, pick up my kid, and I go on. And then the reality that, of the people we're seeing coming in, we have even higher percentages. We just look at the ACEs studies and we can see that. So we should realize, even if if your supervisees don't have a trauma history, and I don't always know that information, sometimes it's shared with me, but I do know that statistic. So in my 9, 33 of those probably have a significant trauma history. That chronic exposure to trauma is likely going to set them up for increased risk of vicarious trauma, secondary trauma, compassion fatigue, impairment, and burnout. Let me see, I want to read something here. Oh, this is, yeah, I wanted to say this. There's some variables, I thought this was really interesting about people who are pouring themselves into their work, which is a good thing again. But there are some variables that are a bit more specific for identifying people who might be at greater risk of indirect or vicarious trauma. Interestingly enough, those with the least education and the most education are at greater risk of experiencing indirect trauma. Which I thought was really interesting, and it also makes sense. So those who have lots of training, PhDs, higher risk because of some of the drive that's associated with that. And then the folks on the other end, so think of QPs, people who are doing direct care, maybe with a bachelor's or even an associate level. Those are at most risk. Those who are newer to the job and those who have the most and least experience working with trauma survivors also have a greater risk of being indirectly supervised. Yeah, I'm gonna skip that. Okay, so one of the things I use in my own training when I'm talking to clinicians as well as parents is that the state of the nervous system, and so I like, students and parents to understand that state changes are happening all day long. The break and the calm, the activation and the break is happening all day long. And that the state of the nervous system isn't just impacting the nervous system, it's impacting the function of my body, the way that my digestive system is working, my heart rate, breathing rate, all of that, heat rate, blood pressure. It's affecting my emotions. It's affecting what I do or don't do, actions or inactions. It's affecting the thoughts. And again, I like Brene Brown's statement of this a little bit better, which is the story that we're telling ourselves, the story that we're believing to be true. The nervous system is impacting that. So when I'm really nervous and I'm sitting across from somebody who I've never seen before, the story I'm telling myself is often, I am not the best counselor. You have no idea. I have no idea. And then the spiritual element of who we are. All of these are being impacted by the state of the nervous system. So, because of the way that we are as humans, and this is a beautiful thing, and it's a terrible thing, we often teach, our supervisees co-regulation. This is so important. But what we sometimes forget is the principle of co-regulation is that nervous systems mirror nervous systems. And so, yes, co-regulation is powerful if I can regulate my nervous system. So when there's a client that comes in and even if it doesn't feel big, but there's a lot of activation, your nervous system as a supervisee, your nervous system as a supervisor with the supervisee is being influenced. And unless I'm on top of that and going, oh, no, I am not letting that angry dad who just came in and started yelling at me because he's not seeing prime, I'm not gonna let that nervous system impact my nerve. I'm gonna stay regulated. And in my regulation, I can actually co-regulate him. But we often forget the first part of that it's mirroring all the time. And I'm not somehow, because I have a clinician title to me, able to sort of regulate yours. Yours is regulating mine, and so I need to regulate mine so that I can help regulate yours. That is exhausting. And anyone who's been in this field knows this is exhausting. It's one of the reasons why this is a lovely field, and it's also an exhausting field. So what are we doing to talk to our supervisees about self-care, about mind, body, spirit care? What kinds of stress management strategies are in place? What kinds of mindfulness practice? I'm always amazed, I shouldn't be, but I'm always amazed at how good my clinicians can be with their clients in teaching this, and how terrible they are at applying it themselves. How terrible. And I can look in the mirror and be guilty. You might want to do this, you might want to do this, and it's like, are you doing those things? Because you gave them a lot. Are you doing those things? Self-care throughout the day. Or actually, I want to say one thing. This is a really cool study that I saw. I was fascinated by it. And it was an affective labeling study by Lisa Feldman Barrett. And she was talking about, she had two groups of people look at screens of faces. They're just showing these faces. And these faces all had very different emotions on them. And in one group, they just looked at these faces. That's it. They did a pre-test and a post-test measuring rates of stress in them. In the other group, they looked at the same pictures, but they just would name what they thought the emotion was. Stress, anger, sorrow. That's it, just one word. And then he did measures of before and after. Maybe to your surprise, definitely to mine, the group that was naming the faces out loud, naming what they saw, actually had lower stress levels after. And the reason that they're saying is it just helps make sense of it. When you add a word, you're just adding meaning, and when we have meaning, it quiets the system. When she's talking about this study, she's talking about the impact of organizations. She's saying, you know what, when you're working at an organization and you're walking and you're seeing stress, to even name, wow, Seth's looking angry today. Seth seemed angry. Ben seemed, just those kinds of things, even in your mind, is actually quite regulating, and it keeps it from hitting you. It's an interesting principle to our supervisees. If you ask them to name the day and the kinds of emotions that came in, that being able to name that is helpful. It also makes me think about how we have this, confidentiality is at play, and it's like I hold all this and I would go home to 3 children and a husband, and I can't really talk about the cases. I certainly could have labeled all the emotions I've seen, but how much this is a helpful principle. What kind of self-care? I work with supervisees, I call them mini moments. No, you cannot take a day off and go to the spa. Unfortunately, that is that's not possible all the time. But you have mini moments. When you're going to the bathroom, that 5-minute break that you take, you can couple with some actual meaningful work to bring you back into the window. So what kind of self-care are your supervisees doing? What times or moments of the day do they feel heaviest? This is going to be different for different supervisees. I have one that does really well with long days. I have others that have to have 2 or 3 hours a day and have really good breaks. Some of that is just knowing their own system. What makes them feel supported? And even in our work, are there things we can focus on during our time? In my work is, how are you? Really, how are you? We do a 5, just like we would do with clients, we do those kinds of check-ins. I ask my students or my supervisees, especially when they're appearing pretty stressed and they're saying, what does your schedule look like? What's max for you today? What has been your rhythm for paperwork? When do you do your what has been your rhythm for paperwork? When do you do your paperwork? I'm not there at site any of my supervisees, so I'm not getting to walk by their offices and encourage them. I get 1 hour a week with most of them. What kinds of boundaries are in place to help them move from session to session? My interns, one of them is watching, we were talking about this, I think, it might have been in another class, it might have been in ethics, just the practices that clinicians have put into place to make sure they're able to physically sort of go, okay, that's done. From a bridge they go over, that this is me, or the practices they have. I often would get on the floor, that was my practice, I close, sometimes flat, sometimes in a posture of kneeling. So normalizing the challenge, this is hard work, it involves our body. And then social life, leisure life, and spiritual life. One of my supervisees is in Italy currently, and we were celebrating so much about just having something on the horizon to look at and to know that that was going to be a break for her. I do like to check on, not personal because I'm not their counselor, but what are you doing outside of work? And what's the name of the book Churchill wrote called, oh my goodness, he wrote a cute little tiny book, and I'm blanking on the name, but the whole book it sounded like a neuroscience book. It's about art, and it's really little, and what he talks about was he obviously was a very stressed out man, and he was carrying the weight of the world, literally, in so much of what he was doing, and so he said people would always tell him, go rest, you need to rest, you need to rest. And one of the things that he writes about was a video called 10 Tips for Caregivers. And one of the tips in that video, she talks about how she just was so overwhelmed at these horrible stories that she would hear. And she started realizing that she needed the opposite. If she was getting a lot of disorder and chaos and ugly, that it was actually helpful for her to go to the opposite. For her, that was beauty and order. And so she says in the video, if you came to my house, you would see a row of flowers in the backyard. And it's very precise, the rows of flowers. She's like, it's important if you're in one thing to immerse yourself in the other. Those are things our supervisees don't know until they're in a state of hyperarousal or burnout or impairment. And so those kinds of things are important.
Dr. Perry, what was the name of the facial expression article?
It's Lisa Feldman Barrett. It's quoted in Permission to Feel by Mark Brackett. He talks about her work on the chapter called Labeling Emotions. He uses an acronym called RULER. It's really good. I actually have a lot of supervisees using it with their clients who have a hard time with feelings. So if our personal lives are supposed to be places that provide us with that buffer and protection from the manifestations of indirect trauma, then what we really want to be encouraging is that our supervisors find a place to talk about those things in a way that is constructive and productive. So we don't have to do that in a way all the time that is particularly unhelpful. So just making sure that they're on top of the last piece of this is stories. I have a nonprofit that things that we do is practice. We have what we call lab time, story lab. And they take the skills they've been learning and they practice in this story lab time. And one of the things that's our caution is that stories are going to activate your stories. And you can either name those and co-opt a story, or you can actually just be aware of, those and co-opt a story, or you can actually just be aware of, I have some things to do. And that's a beautiful thing. It's how we kind of get to grow in this field. I feel like I'm privileged that I've grown as a human being because I've had to, because stories activated my stories. So clinicians need a space to continue unpacking their own past and their present. And one of the lists of questions that are out there for like therapists, make sure your therapist sees a therapist. And I often say that to students and supervisees, because good therapists and supervisees, because good therapists should be seeing a therapist or somebody that helps listen and holds a space for them. Because I do IFS and even many of my supervisees don't use IFS, probably half of them do, but I often will use this language, even when we're stopping the time. What part of you, the part that's feeling like she's not enough, the part that feels like she has to come in and take over and like look like she's got it and has all these amazing tools, the part that just related to your own story. Affective labeling, I've already said that. It really does help with regulation. Giving clinicians a space to be fully known, and what I'm not saying is that I'm doing therapy with my supervisees, but I do think that I am talking into them in a way that kind of mirrors that attachment model that I use, that circle of safety of just, I want you to feel fully known here and safe and connected, so that you actually are sharing with me the ethical dilemma that you got in and you don't want to hide because the parts that are showing up that are causing that. So really wanting them to feel known outside of my office as well. And then what are your own experiences with the theme of this session? So again, I feel bad picking on this particular supervisee with the vet in a wheelchair. That was one of the things we ended up talking about, like what's the theme in this session? And he's like yelling at her, telling her she doesn't know what she's doing. I mean, it was very unkind. It was also his defense at play, big time. But what's this feel like? What's the theme here? And when have you been in this? What does this feel like to you? That's therapeutic. That's good. So I'm going to end this section. This was a good thing. So I'm going to just put that pause there because I know I'm a little on delay. Yeah, and my no pressure to my 3 human beings that are with me in this room. But if you have anything that you do in your work or that was done for you,
knowing what to say, but not saying it. So that was my biggest, how to know that, like I was saying in the beginning, the fear of
which then we won't get into a flow state in session like we should.
The interference of that. That's a great reminder just how much I think we can fool ourselves into thinking, it's fine. I'm just checking my emails, I'm trying to stay on top of it, but it's like this does not foster flow. And that's bringing it to the supervisee. What is it happening in you? What is it experiencing and how are you uniquely experiencing it? Okay, we're gonna, just because I'm aware of the time, we've got about an hour left and we've got 2 more sections. They're a little quicker though. This particular piece is going to talk about processes and practices, but when I think about the process of supervision, I just think about what I said earlier, which is this parallel process like a mirror means that the relation. I certainly have my rhythm and I'm going to share some of those things with you. I don't think it's anything brilliant, but I think it's hopefully going to stimulate some thinking. I certainly went down rabbit holes as well, just what creative things are out there? And frankly, there's not a lot of creativity in this field because we have such things we have to cover. But when you think of your processes or the things that you do, what word that comes to mind? I need some.
Yeah. For me, it's kind of support comes to mind, facilitation.
I like that.
Things like that. It's like coming alongside.
Yeah. When I think about this, especially in just preparing for this piece and knowing I was going to be, especially in just preparing for this piece and knowing I was going to be talking about this, I think of, this is, just being that there are fundamentals always at play.
I would say teaching, especially early, more into that.
Yeah. And I think that's important to remember. I can't, so many students are like, I'm realizing, especially interns, that I really don't have enough. And I'll say, no, you don't. It's sad that a master's program that takes 3 years isn't going to give you enough, but that's not what it was meant to. It's giving you good enough, and that's therapist is a thing, and now you get to go figure out where you're going to get more. This is a thing, and now you get to go figure out where you're going to get more. And for those students who are not voracious learners or don't have the margin, it's a big part. Those who are not voracious learners or don't have the margin, it's a big part.
Nancy also said issues or concerns related to patients and how they're handling those issues.
Yeah, and that's where, Nancy, I'm glad you brought that up because that's where I watch the clock and we have talked about this client every week for 5 weeks. And even my supervisees will be like, I don't want to talk about this client, I just want to give an update. And next thing you know, I'm like, we're at the 10-15 minute mark. So, but those kinds of cases, and they're important, often suck up a lot of time. Why are we here? And structure that is going to teach them that. Who am I going to be for you? The coach, the listener, I like you. The coach, the listener, I like that last one that came in, the attuned supporter. I'm hoping that they're going to take that, just that mirror on mirror, and when I think about what are our expectations, what are our expectations? What do I share? My sequence, it's not magic. It's probably my sequence, it's not magic. It's probably similar to yours. Then what do we do with what I call stuck points, or how do we create flow? How do we offer feedback and evaluation? And then what do we do about ethical dilemmas? And I think keeping, that's exactly right. Sometimes it's not so much as like reporting somebody to the board or flunking an internship student, but it is having hard impairment that's happening. And I was watching a video of somebody who does lots of supervision training, and I thought it was really interesting. I hadn't really thought about this, but he was speaking to the audience and he was like, the problem with supervisors is that most supervisors are supervisors because they are encouragers, and they're just like wanting to build people up. And he's like, you all are too nice. you need to actually speak truth in a loving way. But he talked about the research that showed how hard it is for supervisors to give the most honest feedback, and that we really need to be doing that. And I did think about that in terms of, that can definitely get in the way when I'm seeing a tape and I ask my supervisees, this is sort of what we do, is we celebrate great moments, and I want to see those tapes, but most of our work is your poo, is what we say. Like, I want to see your not so great moments so we can really lean into those. And so they tend to bring the worst clips, or the ones that caused a lot of issues. Expectations, why are we here? Oh, sorry. Keep you up. Sorry, that's got a lot of words on it. It's helping me track. But, this is not going to be anything that's not new to you. This is not going to be anything that's not new to you. But just promoting our supervisory alliance and building rapport, creating safety. One of the ways that I do this is asking a lot of good questions when I have supervisees reach out to me. What drew you to the field? Well, tell me a life. I kind of want to know who they are, just like I would say to us, don't know this client. You're trying to get into treatment, and you don't even know this little boy. You know what his mom told you, but you don't know him. And you're running ahead and teaching him these skills, but you don't know what he loves. You don't know what lights him up. You don't know what makes him run to his room. So spend some time getting to know this little boy or this teenage, prickly presentation client, whatever it is. And it's the same thing. I can't lead who I don't have a connection with. And it's a parenting principle too, right? It's the same thing. Like, it's so important for me to get to know the delights of my supervisees, the things that get them down. Several of them have these things that are happening outside of their lives, and we'll use those as metaphors. Goats and chickens and, the things that they're doing. I want to know those because these are humans we're leading. What are the strengths, values, growth edges, and goals for supervision? I do that in my paperwork. So I do a 1 to 2 page, kind of like an intake form for all of my supervisees, that I want them to write that. And when we talk about it, and it's like, hey, you're actually really good at it. You're really good at this piece. And then kind of like what you were saying, then you lose your voice, but your clinical insight is really strong. So how can we build on that and sort of address some of the areas that are growth edges? What have your past experiences and expectations been in supervision? I had a supervisee, I didn't ask this question. She came from a clinical, from an agency, and she left, and I knew it had been a hard place, and I knew she was overworked and underpaid, and she was now doing a private practice. And it didn't come up until we'd been working for a while, and it was just this sheepish, almost like, like a dog that was shivering. And I was asking her about something, a tape and she just started weeping, expecting something that was going to come from a really harsh supervisor that she'd had. And so really asking, what's it been like, even if you haven't been in the field, but you maybe have been in a supervision relationship, what was that like? What was hard for you? What worked well? Again, this is all the things we ask in intake, but we want our supervisees who are mirroring that. I sometimes will bring up learning style, Enneagram, Myers-Briggs. It's not on my form, though it probably should be, because I think this is really helpful information that we can stumble instead of know out the gate. And then I like to talk about what's my expectation. What does a supervision session with Jackie Perry look like? And this is going to differ between those who are hiring me to do some consultation, once a month that are more experienced, versus most of mine are on a unrestricted license, and what to bring. I don't have I have a halfway measurement and I have an end of our time together measurement. It's actually also a letter that I write them at the very end when we finish our work together. I have those, but most of my feedback is verbal. But my guidelines and expectations are pretty clear. When we get together, we're gonna do a little bit of a check-in. It's really important for me to know how you're doing, those kinds of things. Then just because it's kind of one of those things we have to do for the state of North Carolina, you'll queue up your tape. We'll do about 10 minutes of one of your clients. And I have a sheet, I'll show you the sheet that I use to track clients so that I can keep so that I can remember 9 people's caseloads, because it's insane. So I have a system that I have that's password protected that I use to track. So those kinds of things is how do we start? And this can be such serious work that we neglect this, and I feel like after doing this for a couple years now, I spend a lot of time here. This can unnerve new supervisees because they're just like, I need something from you, and you're like trying to get to know me, and I'm like, yes, and I hope you do the same with your clients that you're running ahead with as well. Okay. Okay, wait a second, I'm out of order here. Yeah, here we go. So sequences, again, that's sort of my arc. And then I do this check-in. So this is, again, if you remember back to my supervision model, one of them is this circle of safety, and it's, I see you, I want them to know I see you, you are safe with me. I'm gonna comfort you in the way that I can, and again, I wouldn't say that out loud, but I am gonna encourage where I can encourage, and we do a check-in, so we're reinforcing that. And then where are we placing our focus? Sort of like what we've just heard is lots of the focus is on tape review. For me, it's a small little piece. I'm just gonna stop here on case conceptualization because this is where I see my supervisees get into the biggest problems, is I maybe haven't heard about somebody on their case because they're feeling okay. And so they bring them into supervision and maybe they've had 5 to 7 sessions and they're stuck. And one of the things I'll show you on my form is just sort of, I ask them to give me like, what's the diagnosis, what's the history, and how are you conceptualizing this case? And oftentimes it's, well, they have anxiety, and then, but what's the problem? What are you addressing? Where are you going? It's the map that is often left behind. And it's such an important thing, and I'll usually say it with a loving smile, but it's like, how are you conceptualizing this case? What do you mean? The diagnosis? No. And this is where I think every training program can do better, with helping students really understand what case conceptualization is, and understanding that really getting all of the pieces of a good case conceptualization takes time, and it really gives you a beautiful map of where to go and where you cannot go, where there's unrealistic to go. But often at that 5th, 6th, 7th, sometimes even like, you've been seeing this person for a year and we're just now talking about case conceptualization with this client. But that's part of supervision. Sort of what's the map? And again, this involves theory and history. It involves treatment goals that are written really well and discussed with the client. This goes back to this whole notion of, and I say this way too much, and I'm told that I say things over and over again, certain things, and one of them is, you teach the client what it is we are doing here. And if you are teaching the client that every week they get to come in and vent for 50 minutes, then you have taught them that that is what therapy is. And we don't want to teach them that. And so then when we're trying to figure out how to do work, no wonder they're like, who are you? Trying to come in and like have me move towards inward focus and discuss the impact of all these people who are driving me crazy. You've never done that before. And so really helping our supervisees go, the outer world is really important as it relates to who's been formed, but the outer world is where we actually help move towards the inner world, the impact of this. And again, all of this matters from case to case, but case conceptualization should be in all caps because it's such an important thing, and I can't catch the start of all of my supervisees' new clients, so we tend to go to those ones that are wonky. Case review, updates, ethical issues, documentation, that's another big one in capital letters. I don't ask every week, although I should, how is your note taking? How are your case notes? And sometimes I'll ask it with a little bit of worry because I'll look at the log that we have, and the log that we have that's a shared document is way behind, so that tells me something. But I've had supervisees go, I'm like, 2 weeks, and those need to be done. And again, I'm not in practice with with any of my supervisees, so I can't walk over and see their EHR systems. Their administrative directors can, but I can't. And then skills. This is a posture of teaching, a lot of modeling, and then of course it's related to their developmental stage. I was gonna say something about clinical writing and I can't remember what I was gonna say about that. I'll say this. One of the areas that I was blessed, I had a psychologist, and I think that made a difference. A psychologist supervised me in my early years of practice, and so psychologists are so good at assessments and reports. And I never had training in writing letters to physicians, in writing summaries, in doing court documents, and everything I wrote, he supervised and rewrote and helped me and really encouraged me, so much so that I would say it's one of my biggest strengths. Most students, especially depending on where their internships are, they're like, oh, I'm supposed to have a termination letter? Oh, should I be reaching out to that physician? And I'm like, they will love you, and you will have too many people on your caseloads if you do some of these practices of sending these documents by fax or whatever to these. So clinical documentation is more than case notes. It's also these letters, and I keep templates on a lot of these letters. It's like, how do you write a medication evaluation, a request for that for your client? How do you do a touch base? I'm seeing your client, just wanted you to know there's an ROI, here it is, fax all that. Those kinds of things, I'm doing some hold handing, so that's the teaching part. I'm gonna stop in just a second and we'll get some questions and feedback. Feedback and evaluation, speaking of feedback. So this, again, is the circle of safety. If I have a good attachment relationship, I can say some encouraging things and some really hard things. And oftentimes, I think it's probably the way I'm mothered, but I think it is really actually, I'll stop and say, what was that like for you to watch yourself on that tape? What was that like for you? What would you have done differently? So they're finding the words to own what I'm already seeing so that I don't have to say the hard thing. And I do think I parented that way. Tell me what was wrong about, or what could have been different. So feedback should be frequent, formal and informal. We should be giving clear, ongoing feedback that makes a difference. And then obviously some techniques, and this is gonna be very much, I'm gonna ask the supervisee to do the work here. I'm not a master of all of the therapeutic approaches that my supervisees are using. So what are you reading right now is a question I'll ask my supervisees. What videos are you watching? What courses are you taking? And these don't have to cost money. The library and YouTube are amazing resources for supervisees who are poor. Digital libraries have changed what we can access as far as books, so helping them get what they need. And my old supervisee self would bend over backwards, just like I did as a novice clinician, working too hard for my clients. My old supervisee self would do the same, supervisor self would do the same thing. Just like, oh, I'm gonna send you this, I'm gonna send you this, oh, I'm gonna copy this chapter in a book. I don't really do a whole lot of that. Every once in a while I'll do that, but I'll point them in the direction, the library, or I'll send them a link in the chat, those kinds of things. It is exactly what I'm saying. The process we are doing with our client, as supervisees, is teaching them, what are we doing here? Who will I be? And how will we do this? It's mirroring. And so we do have people that become mini-me's because of the way we're holding space. They begin to hold that space with their clients. So it's a process that's implicit, but it's at play, and it's worth thinking about. That's the reason it's on this presentation. Stuck points. So again, just like not understanding, feeling frustrated with the client, maybe having some counter-transference or multicultural differences that are just, I don't get your world. I often will encourage the exact same thing that is in the literature about broaching. I'll encourage it in my relationship. What is happening here? Some relational immediacy, or what is it like to have me as your supervisor so far? So that they can actually foster some of that do some of that, mirror some of that in their own work. I had a supervisee a couple of years ago who identified as lesbian, single mom, had been in the education field for a while, Caucasian. She was a student of mine, excellent clinician. I think I had been supervising her for about 18 months, and she came into our session and she said, I have to tell you something. My partner looked you up. I said, okay. And she said, she looked you up and she saw that you have some degree from like a Christian university. And she told me, like, what are you doing getting supervision from her? Like, she went to this university. I went to Georgia State, and then I have a Christian counseling certificate, and then I went to Regent, which is a Christian institution. And she's just telling me what her partner is saying. And I was like, I was surprised the student didn't know this, because you can look this up. And I said, I'll call her Julia. Julia, what has it been like for you to sit across from me? I've been your instructor in 2 courses, and I've been your supervisor for 18 months. Can you honestly tell me what has it been like? And I want you to be as honest as possible. Have you ever felt slighted or unseen or misunderstood or minimized or dismissed or any kind of prejudice against you? And she was like, I think surprised by the question. And she was like, no, that's what I told her, that all those things she saw, I don't know where she saw that, but she put you in a box. And that's what's happening in the client-counselor relationship. And so broaching, it's in our literature, and we need to be doing it with our supervisees as well. So what has it been like so far? You've had me 3 months, you've had me 1 year. What has it been like so far for you to sit across from me? What feels natural and comfortable, and what feels uncomfortable? That's a question our supervisees aren't going to ask without some help. And again, you can see how this process mirrors exactly what I want every good clinician to do with their clients. What has it been like so far? For this young girl who's sitting across from a vet in a wheelchair, that is a question I encourage her to ask. Ask him what it's like to sit across from somebody who is a third his age, who has a master's degree and is more educated academically anyways than he is, etc. So those dynamics play out. I often will ask, particularly if they're not bringing this, I don't know who to talk about. Usually they have a little list. But okay, who are the clients that are making you feel mad, hopeless, stuck, lost, or attracted? And that last one is based on lots of research that shows the vast majority, I think it's like 70% of clinicians have had a client who they've felt attraction to. So we need to be talking about that and naming that and normalizing that we're humans, we have attraction. And naming it actually is going to give you some power over crossing any ethical lines. And then using parts work to increase insight and reduce resistance. So just again, like, what are the parts that come forward? What are the things that you notice get big? Protector parts, manager parts, sassy parts, passive parts, all of those things and the themes that come into play. And then creating space for their narrative. Like, again, sort of, what's the story you're telling yourself with this client? What's happening right there? I've said that a couple of times. I do that oftentimes during tape review. I think that a big part of our work, I think I'm an anxious person if I let myself be. If I'm not on top of it, I go really toward this anxious place. And so I think it's made me a good ethical analysis kind of person, is this what if. Let's play this all the way out. From the question of, I got a client who's the best friend of one of my friends. I didn't know until they came in, and all of a sudden I'm realizing it, to the client who comes in and there's something about the history that feels super activated. Like how do we make these ethical decisions? And so I'm scooting down to that fourth one, but just playing the what if questions, helping our supervisees move it through models. What are the ethical codes at play? This is kind of nerdy, but all of my supervisees have to physically show me that they have a copy of the ACA code, like not digitally. Like I want to see it in a screen. It's the same with the ethics class here. I don't want to see it on a screen. I want to see it in your hand because I want to know that you're engaging with it. You know it's in the code. Why is it an issue? And I'm always surprised by students who really don't know the code. So we really need to be, to this comment of the person who mentioned gatekeeping, we need to be making sure that we're helping our supervisees role play, brainstorm, come up with responses, and then documenting any recommendation. I think it's on my other. This is part of one of the forms that I use, and I'm in a supervision of supervisors group that meets once a month, and I was talking about this a couple months ago, and many of them said they don't use a tracker and they just sort of have a notebook that they write in. I don't have that brain. So I think you probably have that brain. I do not have that brain. Partly because I have too many Maddies, too many same names, and then sometimes the same clinician will have a Molly S and Molly M and it's crazy. So I put, when a person presents a case, I have them say name and demographics, how they present, pronouns, married, single, all of that in that left column, not full name. Sometimes it's just the initials so that if this was, I don't print it out, but if it was ever out. And then presenting problem, history, diagnosis, treatment, and in that first place, that first column, second column, I mean, we talk about conceptualization. And then this is about ethical, that's why it's on there, but making sure that I put any recommendations. That's my CYA move. It's just making sure that I have something on my records that shows I recommended DSS reports. I recommended that we actually refer this client out. I recommended, and we need to remember that, like that this is, that there is a liability that we carry in supervising folks, and it's truly what kept me from doing it for so long, because I was like, I'm working so hard, I don't want to carry somebody else's reputation on my back. I'm going to stop there before I get into practices. I need to stop for my sake. We've got, I don't know, probably 20 more minutes, 30 more minutes, and then we'll close. But I want to hear about, actually, I think I have a slide that says this, but we'll just skip ahead and we'll come back. And then I'm going to go over some techniques. Processes and practices that somebody gave you in terms of how you do your supervision practice that you regularly rely on. It might be some fancy tool you use. It might be something that you always do. It might be the way that you start your session, start your work with a supervisee. And then what are some of the challenges? I think some of them are obvious. What are some of the challenges that you face with processes and practices in supervision? I was going to save this to the end, but frankly, I need a little pause here. So, yeah. And I invite you all on the, is it still running?
Yep.
Okay, I saw some problems with buffering. Yeah, some things that you do that have been really helpful, processes or practices, and then some challenges.
I think just practically for a lot of the supervisees I see, it's hard for them to get recordings in a lot of the sites they're in. If they're in private practice, just like setting up a laptop is awkward. And so it is hard to do, even the question of like, well, what do you, it's hard to practically require it and to review it. And South Carolina doesn't require.
Yeah, I learned that being at CIU, which I was like.
Which is interesting. But
Strongly suggested.
It's strongly suggested, but it is practically difficult.
Yeah.
And then the method of storing it and sharing it with, compliance, and so that's been difficult in wanting to foster, because you only see what they are aware of presenting.
That's right.
Otherwise.
That's right. Right, and if you think about the first hour plus that I talked about, which is the person of the therapist, they only, It's here. They don't have the mirror that we get when we see a little clip.
Right.
It's so helpful to see those clips. Even in North Carolina, it is very difficult. I'll have clients, supervisees, who will come in with a tape that's 2 or 3 weeks old, and I'm like, I mean, you've had 2 sessions, 3 sessions post this, so we're checking a box. Quite a few of mine have now added it in their practices. Some of them are in group practices that it's in there. They discuss it, and they still have to sort of, give a disclosure. We've talked a lot about how to do this discreetly, like how to have devices that have good microphones that we just put on a coffee table and it starts, and there's no video or a red light. I supervise with an organization called CareNet. It's out of Wake Forest in North Carolina, and all of their sites have the, and it's WebEx, and it's pretty amazing. And every supervision, every session, for the most part, is taped. It's part of their work with clients, so that's nice to have, but that's rare.
Mm-hmm.
That's
We have a
rare.
great setup here for our students, but
Yeah. It's unfortunate because even the supervisees who don't get them a lot recognize, like, it's not the same. Our supervision sessions are totally different when we have a tape than when we don't, and their growth is limited.
so part of it is figuring out how do we normalize this? Even like in Europe, supervision is normative beyond your
That's
initial temp period, right? Where we're like, all right, put in your couple years and then you're proficient enough to do it on your own, instead of normalizing, even if it's consultation or peer support versus, supervision.
Yeah.
Trying to normalize these different behaviors that are gonna contribute to more effective care and protect, liability protection for those doing the care.
Yeah. I joined a group a couple of years ago, kind of reluctantly. I don't know why I didn't want to join it. I think it was just one more thing, but it is a supervision of supervisors group. And that actually has been very helpful for me, just because we will often talk about new things on the horizon. The compact is one that we've talked about. We've talked about laws that came up in North Carolina around reporting in 2019 that changed the way that we report even over 18 reports and things like that to have, so that I'm on top of things like that. I don't know if nobody else has anything. Do you have any gems to offer? Any things that you love to do or that somebody did for you practice-wise that are sort of strategies? Either of you?
I don't know, I probably picked this up, but when I'm doing dyadic supervision, I'm working with one supervisee. At some point, I'll kind of shift rather rapidly and say, hey, what are your thoughts about this case? That's to keep them focused, right, so they don't dissociate. But my hope is that that's just something but a confidence, like, I value your voice in this place, and you can help. And sometimes they will say really good things that I hadn't thought of.
Yeah.
So it's actually beneficial for the whole trial.
Yeah. Which is so important to remember, because I think, kind of like what you were saying too, is just this idea that I don't really have much to offer. And they do. It's just another set of eyes. I'm always amazed in our internship class when the peers offer. I always go at the end and I'll be like, you really, it's amazing how 8 heads working together on one case, or in that case 3, really do make a difference. But that's broaching, Brian. That's like saying, I want to give you space to say something, and when we create that space, we actually...
Occasionally I get not so great ideas too.
That's true. That's true. And then what do you do?
Okay, it's a good thought, tell me where that came from, and then we try and, see where we can go.
Yeah, but even that response I love, because it's mirroring exactly what we would want them to do with a client. It's just sort of like, okay, let's find the root. Like, where did that come from? Versus judging it or shutting it down. So that therapeutic technique, it just all plays into what they're doing.
Nicole said, I try to integrate a balance of developing person of the therapist with skills that are supportive of their caseload. The biggest challenge is always time and timing of learning opportunities and recording. Try to do code facilitation or live observation when possible. It's my favorite, but not always possible.
Yeah, I would love to do some live observation, but none of my they're not in settings where I can do that, because I'm not an employee where they are, or their group practices. But I think that would be an amazing thing. I went to a program that had a mirror, And we got feedback that way, and it was terrifying. It was also incredibly helpful. So our agency does supervision for everyone, including supervisors. I just think that's huge, because for me it's voluntary. I have to obviously pay for it. It's so important to be around other people who are in our field, both clinicians as well as supervisors. Well, let me go back and I'll bring us home in this last piece. It's long, but I'm going to zoom through much of it. I had meant for us to take a break, but it's a little awkward online, so I think I may have us try to end a little before the 11:30, so you have plenty of time to do a feedback form. So we're in the home stretch. Okay. In the practices, these certainly overlap, but this is also, the practices that I'm doing are helping with the practices of the clinician in their sites. So intakes, I have the wrong sheet. Intakes, paperwork, treatment goals, rhythms of practice, trauma-informed lens, all of these, I've touched on most of them. I want to sort of dig in a little bit more. So I think good intakes can prevent bad practice because expectations from all parties are made clear. So one of the things I will work on a lot with a young supervisee is tell me about your intake. I do have some really good tools. I was trained in a time where we actually were taught not to have a piece of paper between you and the therapist. So it's all here and maybe note taking. I still firmly believe in that because I think the research shows when I'm looking down, that's the nonverbal, and I'm losing them. So I'm one of those old schoolers, and my supervisees know it. I also wasn't trained on what I call click intakes, which drive me crazy because it's the clinician doing this, and it just has moved us to this medical model that I'm not happy about. Like it or not, this is where some of our supervisees are, and we need to know it. But more importantly, it's like if you're doing what I call click screens, or you have to do a form, or you can't remember, and that's sometimes the case, that we really make sure that we're helping our supervisees know that the beginning of this relationship is from the moment they're looking at you in the eyes. And so how you care for them, how you see them, how you offer safety, how you clarify that I have limits to this work, and how you talk about those limits of confidentiality are so important. It's some of the things I hammer in my ethics class is this cannot just be a little list that you hope they read. This has got to be something that you talk about. With those of you who have supervisees that see minors, the importance of this is dialed up dramatically. So really giving your supervisees specific examples to be able to use in an intake. And this is where I'm feeding them, because it's 33 years of working with families and actually doing some things poorly that I learned. I probably need to really talk about what a pattern of harm or harm to self or others looks like when we're talking about a 10-year-old versus a 16-year-old. And I'll often give the example with those kinds of limits of with the child in the room, always. This means that you tell me you smoke weed, I don't have to tell your parent. You tell me you're smoking weed, you're selling, you're carrying a gun, this is a real client, and you're going out every night and you're dealing and you got nicked with a bullet on. We've got a pattern of harm. Maybe that's extreme, but it's a judgment call for me as a clinician. So I'm looking at the parent and I'm looking at the kid. So those kinds of things, I model that because our supervisees are coming in with just maybe their internship experience that wasn't with kids or even with adults, really giving a lot on intakes. And I used to teach a workshop for 3 hours on what does a good intake entail. It's so important to have a good one. Even things like I say to clients, you've spent a lifetime trying to keep what happened, this is for trauma, to you behind the door. The feelings, the experiences, it takes so much effort to keep that door closed, and you've spent a lot of effort and energy. And I want you to know that we are not going to open that door right away. That's not what our work is about. Our work is going to be about helping you open that door a little bit at a time so that you feel like you're in control and not the feelings. That little metaphor of working, that metaphor has been really, really helpful. I'm not here to bust open the door. those kinds of metaphors, I think helping our supervisees finding them is really, really, really important, that we are collaboratively caring. And the way that we start with our clients is, again, goes back to that slide, is I am teaching this client, who am I? What are we doing here? Why are we here? And how is this gonna go? And this is established truly on the screen call at times, but very much so in that first session. Okay. So inviting clients to talk about, so this is just making sure I make sure that supervisees know this, that they don't stop at the first session to gather key information, the pressure of putting that diagnosis on and getting billing. I won't get on that soapbox, but it angers me so much because we often are doing stabilization for clients that are really not okay with that first session, and we don't have a lot of information. I always want to see at least one intake with one of my supervisees, even if it's a recorded intake, that we're going to spend a lot of how do you start that first 20 to 30 minutes. And I'll forget about this. I actually was like, I need to check back in with a couple of my new ones and do a couple more intakes, because we got a lot of correction that happened on some of those. But noticing their process, their dynamics, what are they saying, what's the pace, and how important that is. And then I mentioned this before when I was talking about paperwork. This is the yuck part of our job, is the fact that many of our clients come in and there are other people involved in their lives that we need to be collaborators with. And I never have regretted the extra work I put into talking with physicians. I worked with a lot of kids with OCD and anxiety, lots of gastric issues, so the pediatric gastroenterologist and I were friends, professional friends, but those kinds of people are really, really helpful. Helping clients, supervisees know that your feedback is essential for the psychiatrist or the PP, the primary care provider, the PCP that's involved. And there's such a sheepishness, and I don't know how to talk to a physician. Yes, you do. You actually have more data than the physician does, because the only data they have is what is being shared. So all of the people that are involved, that is one of the things on an intake or in those first few cases, I always say, is there medicine? Have you had an ROI? Oh, there's not an ROI. And this person is taking all of these medications, and they didn't want to give you an ROI. What do you see as the problem with that? And there's 2 different physicians giving this medication that is pretty intense. Those are really, really helpful for our supervisees to remember. And then I said this before because it's one of my, it's just the treatment goals and how important it is to set these from the start. One of the things in those cases with families or parent-child, even whether they're 17 or 7, is from the start having a supervisee begin to have a conversation with the parent or guardian about the frequency of involvement. That's really important. There's assumptions on the part of parents they're going to be really involved or not at all, that they can drop their child off. There's assumptions on the part of the child, and there's assumptions on the part of the clinician. We have to collaborate. So with people, who are seeing definitely 12 and unders, I'm like, you're not going to do any change if you don't have the parents involved. So you really need to have some kind of frequency. This is really hard when people are doing school-based work. And I recognize that. I am not supervising any school-based providers as supervisees, but I have quite a couple in my internship. And this is limiting because of the limited involvement of parents when you have a 7-year-old who's but how much are we going to, and what are the creative ways that we do that? I mean, this is an amazing thing that has brought a parent into a session digitally, whether it's on a Zoom screen or even FaceTime or a phone call, that we talk together about what we're working on. So creative ways to do that. What I mean by this next one is, especially, and this is not just for children and teens, this is for adults too. Session 10, session 15, session 25. I see a therapist, I know how this goes, I forget the goals. I mean, the broader when you're doing, that kind of work, but helping people who are working with younger folks think about creative ways to bring those into the room, and I mean external. So the thing that I talk about with those who work with children and adolescents is you have to externalize the work. It cannot be all this, and so we bring in metaphors, we create, we draw, and so sometimes it means if you have 3 goals, 3 little laminated cardstock, yellow goal, red goal, blue goal, and you pull those out on the coffee table. Which one are we going to focus on today? Again, teaching supervisees that you are reminding the client all the time, what is it that we are doing here? I've already talked about this, clinical notes, templates for medication, evaluations, all the correspondence. Some supervisees have come from amazing institutions where they've learned the Columbia or the CAMS or all kinds of suicide assessments, and some have not. And so making sure that every one of my supervisees is on board. I prefer the CAMS. It's a long one, but it's super detailed. It's really, really helpful, and the model that's behind that I really believe in. But whatever students are using or supervisees, but I always make sure, because obviously you all know as supervisors, this happens when we're not ready. So making sure that we have something readily available, paper form as well as digitally, is really, really helpful. Also with minors, talking about the difference between self-harm and suicide, and when we have safety plans, how parents have to be involved. This is a silly thing, but it's come up a couple times in my supervisee load. So I thought, I'm just gonna share this because I've had 2 different supervisees talk to me about how they're not ending on time and how they're having a hard time, and they're just like, it messes up my whole day, and my supervisor is pretty frustrated, and I've never shared this with you, but I'm having a really hard time. Like, I kept somebody in for 75 minutes, and my first question is always this, and it's so silly, but I'm like, how many clocks do you have in your office? I have 6 digital clocks that don't make noise all over, and often they're like, 1, and I'm like, where is it? Can the client see it? Your clients will track. I track. Mine sits behind my therapist's head. It's like right there, and I'll go, no, I'm not bringing that up. Some of this is just like that little physical thing of how many clocks. I used to teach a Pratt course at a university, and we'd always do this game at the end of the year, and I'd give away prizes, and one of the prizes was always like 2 cheap clocks. There's flip clocks. I'm like, you will need this. You need it for tracking. So that's those little ideas and practical strategies. I've never used a chime, but I've had a couple supervisees that have a soft chime that goes off at the 40-minute mark that they have a conversation about, that is like, you'll hear it. It doesn't mean stop talking. It just means we're at the end and we're going to start talking about transition. So I think those kinds of things are really, really helpful. And then what is it about the session or even the client that you're not naming? Sometimes it's like they keep bringing up stuff the last 10 minutes, and then there we are. Well, then we talk about that. We talk about that, and we talk about, there's a pattern I've been noticing, and giving them courage to do that. We'll end the last part on what I think is really, really important, and it goes back to the way I started, which, regardless of what theory our students or supervisees are using, it is utmost for us, because we know better, to make sure that we're using a trauma-informed lens, and that we're really educating our supervisees, or asking them to go educate themselves on trauma. I will say to students now at this program and all the programs I've worked with, in my age, this wasn't an issue. It is now, and it was where I ended up as I moved through the field, but you have got to have a modality that you understand that addresses trauma. You need to have an understanding of trauma because of the mass numbers of people that we are seeing who have some kind of trauma background. So research is demonstrating that in mental health, substance abuse, forensics, and child welfare settings, a disproportionate number of clients seeking services have a history of trauma, predominantly some kind of interpersonal victimization. The interesting thing is that the research even shows that even after mass disasters, mass events, the people who seek help actually tend to be people who have a history of trauma.
They're not people without a trauma history, more of them. So even in the aftermath of major events. And that these don't affect people equally. One writer I read says this is all in the eye of the beholder, and by that, obviously you all know that a traumatic event can be traumatic for one person and not for the other because of individual history, traits, cultural factors, all of that. Going back to that arrow in the nervous system, trauma impacts all of those and creates new stressors. And so we see those co-occurring disorders. So one of the things that is helpful to kind of know is some of my supervisees did their internships in trauma-focused settings. They were at shelters. They were at locations that what they were working on was the trauma. But most of my supervisees, if not all, are at problem-focused settings. Why does that matter? Well, because somebody is coming in to address this problem and the trauma history is not it's not in their mind. And so helping our clients remember, not just doing a good intake, but knowing just because they're coming in to do some parent-child work doesn't mean that the factors in the history aren't affecting it. So statistically, trauma is typically in the background when you look at the types of people who are coming in for help. And then the guiding principles, that's from SAMHSA, are those important things to think about in terms of trauma-informed care as well as practice. I said this already, but part of it is helping our supervisees understand how much trauma is affecting them vicariously with secondary stress and compassion fatigue and how it is changing the mind, body, and spirit of the clinician. And then the client resistance because of the impact of the trauma on what are called I-me beliefs. It's like how much the story that people begin to tell themselves is affected by trauma, and so it affects even why do I need to care? Self-defeating or sabotaging behaviors. Again, helping supervisees make sure that they know what the impact of trauma is. And then expressing frustration. I mean, again, going back to this live and very much a present tense case, this case of the vet who's seeking help from this young clinician that I'm supervising, and just inviting her frustration about that and letting her talk and name all of that, and then helping her to also bridge back to really understanding what he's been through. And some of it she doesn't know. Some of it she doesn't have the full story, and so she doesn't have an alliance with him yet, and she's wanting to take him somewhere, and she has not actually heard any of his story, partly because he doesn't really want to share it and he thinks it's irrelevant. So moving people from the world of should to the world of this is where you are instead of where you want to be. And then again, always looking back at that alliance. I used to assume that students knew the triphasic model of trauma, and they just don't, and so it can be reckless. Speaking of do no harm, when clients are engaging a narrative, when supervisees are engaging a narrative and they don't have a clear model and there's no stabilization, or there's an assumption that they've done work with another clinician and that they know how to stabilize themselves. So oftentimes, especially young clinicians want to move to that middle stage, and I'm always talking about you may be the one who really is in this stage with them, and you and many other clinicians may be working for a long time on stabilization before you get to the second part of that phase. And then I've already talked about just again state changes in the supervisee, making sure they're tuning in. There was a tape we were watching the other day, and I said, what just happened? What just happened with the client right there? And we went back, and the client put her head back, and she was like, oh, I don't think I noticed that. And then she put her hand on her chest, and it was like you could tell there was an activation. And she started sharing this non-present tense. It was a delusion. So it was really interesting. And again, it was like, tune into those things that are happening in the nervous system, and then what the story is that's being told, because in this case we weren't sure if it was real. We were pretty sure it wasn't a real story because of what was happening. Regulation tools, distress tolerance, words like titrating and pendulating, those are from somatic experiencing, the small amounts, and then going back from something that's activating to something that's safe, helping clients or supervisees, sorry, I keep switching, notice and observe instead of evaluating, not just in the client, but also in themselves. What's happening in you? What do you notice? Engaging the watchtower of the brain, or the upstairs brain, and then shame and narrations. I talk a lot about shame in my work. This is this is from a parent thing I did. I pulled it together from 2 different slides, but I talk a lot about this. This is what the nervous system is always asking all day long, 24/7, and the answer to those 4 questions, this is the work of Dan Siegel, is affecting state changes. So when I see a client or a supervisee and I'm noticing a state change, makes me curious. What's happening? Do they feel physically, emotionally, spiritually unsafe? Do they feel unseen? They don't feel accompanied or with? Do they not feel like they're feeling regulated or co-regulated with me? Or are they losing their footing? Those kinds of things. And then when the answer is more yeses than nos, we see mobilization, more nos than yeses, or opposite. We see calm, collected, connected, and in all of this, this is going on all day long. So with the supervisee, I'm noticing this, and I'm asking them to notice this. That's the mirror on mirror with their clients, and I'm noticing it in my work. We're gonna end in a minute. I think this is good language, even for adults, of the zones of regulation. I use polyvagal ladder because I think it really helped me make sense of the pandemic personally, but just helping clients and supervisees begin to use that language and understanding where they are and what can happen and what can't as far as cognitive capacities when you're up in the red zone and you fall to blue, or using polyvagal when you collapse because of parasympathetic collapsing. And then, again, this is my favorite stuff to read. This is the work of Deb Dana, who has made Stephen Porges's work a little bit more palpable, in my humble opinion. But she talks about this idea of neuroception, is his word that he coined. The nervous system is always taking it in, and then we perceive it, and then the first place where we're really aware of it is our autonomic state. And that's why we're doing so much work trans-theoretically about helping our supervisees help their clients and themselves tune into state, because state, I heard a supervisee say this to me a couple months ago, and I just smiled. I was like, oh, it just feels so nice to hear her say it. She goes, it was so clear his state was affecting his story, and I was like, yay, that's language that we've been using. Is state affects emotions, which affect actions, which affects the story you're telling yourself. I've said this to my kids even, state affects story. So if we are in an activated state, what we're telling ourselves is very different. So physiological state creates, and she talks about it like a river, and that we want to sort of move back to state, regulate it, and do some good work there.
Do you have a favorite resource teaching triphasic model of trauma?
You probably do. I mean, I just use
Judith
those.
Herman.
Yeah. Any of Judith Herman's books I like. And I have pulled the triphasic model, I should have pulled it for here, but there's lots of great graphics. I just pull those free when I'm doing some kind of screen share. Yeah, I love Judith Herman's work. And then, these are some fancy words that we're hearing a lot about. Sometimes supervisees have used them and they don't fully know what they mean, so we talk about these. I'm not trained in somatic experiencing, but I like some of the language that he talks about, especially in helping supervisees know how to navigate activation in session and how to use some of those techniques. You can't see this. I put it in there because if you wanted to look at this, there's some really good trauma-informed supervision guidelines that are really helpful for us to think about as supervisors that we're integrating into our work. I am going to end there, but we do have 6 or 7 minutes. What I would like for you to do during this 6 or 7 minutes is 1, fill out the form that I think you have a link to. And 2, do you have any questions? I hope that this was helpful. Now, my goal when I go to seminars is always to, maybe I'll have one takeaway. One good reminder, one good takeaway. So that's my hope for each of you is that you had one good takeaway, one nugget that you're gonna apply. And I wonder if there are any questions or comments. I hope this was helpful. I'm up for renewal this year, so CEs are a wonderful thing.
I think it's just it's easy to get into the rhythm both with clients and with supervisees, where you just kind of do instead of remembering, especially with supervisees, that they don't know necessarily.
They don't know,
right?
and there's so many holes.
Yeah.
And yeah, and I think, right, there's a balance between like me running ahead and going, you know this, and me just encouraging. What are you doing? What are you reading? Where are you getting some information?
Alright, well, looks like send out the link.
Yeah, so I wanna say that, well, I think it's a slide on here, I wanna say, thank you. I do wanna hear if there's anything else, but I do just wanna thank you. This work, I don't know about you, but my rate for reimbursement on supervision is much lower than clinical rates. It's a hard job, and I think it's a really privileged job too, to be able to pour into the next generation. When I'm working with one supervisee and imagine the impact of our work on the many dozens of clients, it actually, it balances out some of the difficulty and the challenges that sometimes we have in this work. I personally love supervising. I didn't think that I was enjoyed as much as I do, but I thank you for the work that you're doing and investing in people's careers and in their clients.